It is March 2026. If you walk past the Barbican Library in London today, you'll see a line stretching around the corner. They aren't there for a tech launch or a political rally. They are there for a glimpse of a platform sneaker and a Union Jack patterned piece of fabric. As the exhibition, 1996, a celebration of the wildest year, prepares to open, a strange realization hits us. We aren't just looking at costumes, we are looking at the blueprints of our modern identities. To understand the Spice Girls in 2026, we first have to remember the greyness of 1996. Britain was weary. It was the year of the BSE, mad cow disease crisis, and the final bitter gasps of a long-standing government. The music scene was dominated by Britpop, a genre that, for all its genius, was undeniably lads-only. It was Parkers, cigarettes, and a very specific type of male bravado. Then, 5 women in mismatched outfits literally burst through the doors of a posh hotel in a single-take music video, and the world shifted from monochrome to technicolor. The manufactured myth versus the reality. There is a common cynical take, the logic nerk, that the Spice Girls were merely a cynical marketing product, a manufactured group created by men to sell lollipops and Polaroid cameras. Critics in the 90s loved this narrative because it stripped the women of their agency. But here is the counter-argument. If they were just a product, they would have expired like a carton of milk by 1999. Instead, in 2024, the Royal Mint issued collectible coins in their honor, the first time a girl group has ever been treated as a national treasure, on par with the monarchy. You don't get your face on a coin just by being a marketing fluke. You get there because you became a cultural pillar. Why it felt different. I remember talking to a friend who grew up in a small town in the north of England during that time. She told me, before the Spice Girls, being a feminist felt like a heavy academic chore. Then Geri and Mel B arrived, and suddenly empowerment looked like having a loud laugh and a loyal circle of friends.
The genius wasn't in the music alone, though Wannabe spent 7 weeks at #1 and became the best-selling single by a female group in history. The genius was the personality architecture. They gave us 5 distinct archetypes. In a world that told girls they had to be one thing, the Spice Girls said you could be the athlete, the bookworm, the rebel, or the princess, and you were still part of the gang. We look back now, 30 years later, and realize they weren't just singing about friendship, they were conducting a massive social experiment in female solidarity. They didn't ask for a seat at the table, they kicked the table over and started a party on top of it. If you look at the glossy posters from 1996, you see 5 girls who look like they were born for the spotlight. But history is often written by the victors, and we tend to scrub out the misfits. Before there were the Spice Girls, there was a group called Touch, and in that original lineup, there was no Baby Spice. Instead, there was Michelle Stevenson. The frequency of fame. The story usually told is a tragic one. The girl who walked away from billions because of a lack of fit or family issues. But there is a sharper, more logical way to look at this. Michelle was, by all accounts, an incredibly talented vocalist, but talent isn't the same as alchemy. The Spice Girls weren't looking for a lead singer, they were looking for a frequency. When Emma Bunton joined, she brought the sugar that allowed the spice of Mel B and Geri to be palatable to the mainstream. This is a lesson many of us forget today. Success isn't always about being the most skilled person in the room, it's about being the right piece of the puzzle. Michelle's departure wasn't a mistake, it was the necessary pruning of a tree before it could bear fruit.
The great management coup of 1997. By November 1997, the Spice Girls were the most famous people on the planet. They were managed by Simon Fuller, the man who would later create American Idol. He was the architect, he was the brain. Conventional wisdom says you don't fire the man who made you. Yet, in a move that shocked the music industry, they did exactly that. At the height of their power, they sat Fuller down and told him they were taking the reins themselves. The reframing, was it madness or mastery? Most critics at the time predicted their immediate collapse. They called it suicidal. But if we look at this through a 2026 lens, we see something else. The first act of radical female autonomy in modern pop. They realized that the girl power they were selling would be a lie if they were still being told what to do by a man in a boardroom. They took over their own scheduling, their own branding, and even their own movie production, Spice World. There is a fascinating logic here that few people notice. The Spice Girls didn't just sing about empowerment, they stress-tested it. They were willing to risk their entire careers to prove they weren't puppets. Did it lead to burnout? Probably. Geri Halliwell would leave the group only 6 months later, exhausted by the sheer weight of self-management. But they proved that they weren't just lucky, they were in control. Why this matters to us now? Think about your own career or life. How many times have we played it safe because we were afraid to fire the experts telling us how to live? I once spoke to a woman who was a teenager in London during that 1997 coup. She said, "Seeing 5 women fire the most powerful man in music gave me the courage to quit my dead-end job. I figured if they could manage a global empire at 22, I could manage my own life."
The Spice Girls were the original disruptors. Long before Silicon Valley made the word a cliché, these 5 women disrupted the power dynamics of an entire industry. They were the ones who taught us that the most important thing you can own isn't a hit record, it's your own voice. By the spring of 1997, the Spice Girls weren't just a band, they were a sovereign state. They had their own flag, their own currency in the form of endless merchandise, and a global reach that rivaled the British Empire at its height. But while the world saw a marketing frenzy, something much more subtle was happening to the identity of Britain itself. The tea towel that reclaimed a flag. In February 1997, Geri Halliwell walked onto the stage of the Brit Awards in a dress that would become the most famous piece of clothing in pop history. The logic of the establishment at the time was that the Union Jack belonged to the far right or the stuffy post-war generation. It was a symbol of the past, of Great Britain in decline. Geri's dress changed that in 3 minutes. Most people assume it was a high-fashion statement. In reality, it was a DIY act of rebellion. Geri's sister literally stitched a Union Jack tea towel onto a black Gucci mini dress because Geri felt the Gucci dress was too boring. By wearing it, she performed a radical act of rebranding. She snatched the flag away from the politicians and gave it to the girls in the front row. Suddenly, the flag didn't stand for empire, it stood for cool Britannia. It was the ultimate British moment because it was cheeky, cheap, and impossibly loud.
Spice Mania, the $500 million social network. Critics in 1997 were scathing about the group's relentless merchandising. They were on Pepsi cans, Polaroid cameras, Chupa Chups wrappers, and Walker's Crisps packets. To the intellectual elite, this was the ultimate sellout. But if we look closer, the merch wasn't just about money. It was the 90s version of a social network. The Polaroid Spice Cam. This wasn't just a pink and purple camera, it was a tool for self-documentation. Long before Instagram and the selfie culture of 2026, the Spice Girls were telling young women, your life is worth photographing. You are the star of your own movie. The numbers. In 1997 alone, they generated over $500 million in sponsorship deals. They were the most heavily merchandised group since the Beatles, but with one key difference. They targeted a demographic, young girls, that the industry had previously ignored or patronized. A personal connection, the spice drawer. I remember a story from a woman who grew up in London's East End. She said her family couldn't afford the concert tickets or the high street fashion, but she could afford a 50p pack of Spice Girls stickers. That sticker on my school notebook was my armor, she said. It told the boys in my class that I belonged to something bigger than their playground rules. This is where the sellout argument falls apart. For a generation of girls, these products weren't just stuff, they were symbols of belonging. The Spice Girls used the machinery of capitalism to distribute a message of confidence to every corner of the globe. The 2026 perspective, the first true influencers. Looking back from 2026, we realize the Spice Girls were the world's first true influencers. They understood that a brand isn't just a product, it's an ecosystem. They turned their personalities into a lifestyle. When you bought a sporty Spice tracksuit, you weren't just buying clothes, you were buying the permission to be athletic and competitive.
They proved that you could be a commercial juggernaut and a cultural revolutionary at the same time. They didn't just sell us lollipops, they sold us the idea that our joy, our friendships, and our girliness had immense economic and social value. They made it cool to be a fan, and in doing so, they paved the way for every fandom that dominates our digital world today. Every generation has a "where were you" moment. For some, it was the moon landing. For others, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But for a specific demographic in Britain and across the globe, that moment happened on a Sunday afternoon, May 31, 1998. The news bulletin was short and brutal. Geri Halliwell has left the Spice Girls. It felt like a national divorce. It wasn't just a pop star leaving a group, it was the removal of the engine from the Ferrari. Geri, Ginger Spice, was the loud, brash, Union Jack-wearing heartbeat of the band. Without her, the colours of the 90s suddenly felt a little more muted. Why the breakup was the best thing for their legend? There is a common perspective that Geri's departure was a catastrophic mistake that ended the golden era. And while it's true that the group's imperial phase took a hit, let's look at the counterintuitive logic. The breakup saved their legacy. If the Spice Girls had stayed together as a five-piece for another 5 years, they likely would have faded into the past their prime territory that kills the magic of pop. By fracturing at the absolute zenith of their power, they became frozen in time. They didn't become a legacy act trying to keep up with the 2000s. They remained the undisputed queens of the 90s. Leaving while you are at the top is the ultimate power move in branding. It turned them from a band into a myth. The human cost of girl power. We often forget that these were women in their early 20s running a billion-dollar empire. Geri's departure wasn't just about ego or disagreements. Years later, she revealed the reality: exhaustion, eating disorders, and a desperate need to find out who Geri was without the ginger. This is the part of the story that resonates most in 2026, in an era where we finally talk openly about mental health and burnout. We can look back at 1998 and realize that Geri was simply the first to hit the wall. She wasn't betraying her friends, she was practicing the ultimate form of girl power, self-preservation. The playground silence, a personal anecdote. I remember a story from a teacher who worked at a primary school in London the Monday after the announcement. She said the playground was eerie. There were no games, no shouting, just groups of 8-year-olds sitting in circles, literally mourning. For those children, the Spice Girls were the first proof that friendship was indestructible. When Geri left, that illusion shattered.
It was a brutal lesson in adult reality that people you love can leave, that forever is a marketing term, and that even the strongest bonds can fray under pressure. The evolution of the four-piece, 1998 to 2000. However, the logic of the four-piece era, 1998 to 2000, is underrated. It forced the others to grow. Mel C stepped up as the vocal powerhouse, proving she was one of the best singers of her generation. Goodbye is arguably their most musically sophisticated hit. Victoria began her transformation from the girl who doesn't sing much into the fashion icon we know today. They proved that the brand was bigger than any one person. They completed a sold-out North American tour as a quartet, a feat of professionalism that few groups could manage after such a traumatic split. The fracture of 1998 didn't kill the Spice Girls. It humanized them. It turned them from superheroes into women. And in the long run, we don't fall in love with superheroes. We fall in love with people who struggle, break, and eventually find their way back to each other. As we stand in 2026, 30 years after that first Zigga Zigga echoed across the airwaves, the Spice Girls have achieved something far more difficult than topping the charts. They have rewritten the script on how women age in the public eye. In the 90s, the pop industry had a brutal expiration date for female artists. You were a star until you were 25, then you were old news. But the Spice Girls refused to follow that timeline. They didn't just fade into the background, they evolved into 5 distinct, powerful archetypes of womanhood in the 21st century. The Royal Transformation. There was a moment in 2012 that changed everything. It wasn't a concert, it was the London Olympics closing ceremony, when those 5 neon-lit black cabs pulled into the stadium and the Spice Girls stood on top of them singing Wannabe to a global audience of billions. They were no longer a pop group, they were officially part of the British DNA, standing alongside the Queen and James Bond as icons of the nation. Many critics say the Spice Girls are finished because they haven't released a new album in decades, but that misses the point. Their greatest product in 2026 isn't a song, it's the fact that they are still fundamentally a unit. In an industry that thrives on feuds and burnouts, the Spice Girls' ability to reunite, whether at the 1919 Stadium Tour or at Victoria's 50th birthday party in 2024, is their most radical act of girl power. They proved that the friendship they sang about wasn't just a lyric, it was a lifelong commitment.
Victoria Beckham. For years, Victoria was the punchline of the group. She doesn't sing, the critics sneered, she just pouts. But look at her in 2026. She is the head of a global fashion empire worth tens of millions, a woman who successfully pivoted from posh spice to a respected designer. She proved that the Spice Girls wasn't a peak, it was a launch pad. She used the visibility the group gave her to build something entirely her own. She taught a generation that you don't have to be the loudest voice in the room or the best singer in the band to be the most successful person at the table. Why 2026 needs a Zigga Zigga more than ever. We live in a world of algorithms, curated social media feeds, and cancel culture. Everything feels polished, clinical, and a little bit lonely. This is why the 2026 exhibition at the Barbican is so crowded. People aren't just nostalgic for the 90s, they are hungry for the unfiltered joy the Spice Girls represented. They were messy, they were loud, they made mistakes, they wore too much glitter and sang about wanting a Zigga Zigga, which, let's be honest, none of us can still define. They represented a time when girl power wasn't a corporate slogan used to sell sneakers, it was a feeling in your chest. It was the belief that you and your 4 best friends could take on the world and win.
A final thought. The mirror of our lives.
I recently heard a story about a woman who took her teenage daughter to see the Spice Girls exhibition. The daughter asked, "Mum, why were they so important?" The mother replied, "Because before them, I didn't know I was allowed to be loud. They were the first people who told me that my girlhood was a superpower, not a weakness." That is the true legacy of the Spice Girls. They didn't just give us hit records, they gave us a mirror. In that mirror, we saw ourselves, not as we were supposed to be, but as we wanted to be. So, as we look at those 2026 Royal Mint coins and walk through the aisles of 90s nostalgia, let's remember, the Spice Girls didn't just change music, they changed us. And 30 years later, that friendship between them and us really does never end.